All right, we're going to get started. Dylan, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. I think we'll have some others joining here soon, but we'll go ahead and get started um, with talking about soybean data from last year on the OVT side, and then doing some um, quick, quick choices. Sorry, can't talk this morning. Some quick choices in making soybean variety decisions based off of last year's data and based off of multiple years of data. I always start these off with looking at what the prior year did. So that's hopefully what everybody's seeing. Dylan, do you see a big map of North Carolina?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. So these are our 17 soybean locations that we tested out last year. That's the most that we've ever done. We increased by 3 locations from last year. 9 of those were full season, 8 of those were double crop, and you see kind of their distribution across the state. Where you see the different blue, green X's, we actually had separate full season double crop fields, and usually those double crop fields are either after wheat or after barley in the case of Yadkin County. Where you see the black X's, the double crop is actually just a delayed planting. We either didn't have wheat in that area or the grower preferred that we just did a delayed planting into bare ground. So the vast majority of these were behind wheat for double crop, but overall 17 locations across the board. Despite the challenging year, we actually were able to report on just about all the tests from all those different locations. The the exception in this case, and it's not a full exception because we still reported on tests from each one of these 4 sites, are the 4 that I've highlighted here in red. This was mostly due to extremely wet weather later in the year. So this is Union double crop, Robinson double crop, Sampson double crop, all had very wet weather. We lost some plots to some saturated soils in that situation. We still had tests that we were able to report. We're just going to report all the tests from those locations. And then person full season, a little bit different. We actually had some heavy deer pressure at that site where we couldn't report all the tests. But again, a lot of tests were able to be reported from those 4 overall 17 locations worth of data, a little over 10,000 plots worth of data executed last year for soybeans. So I like looking at our yield trends. Usually I'll look at it a single year and then I'll show you some bigger trends based off of the database that we have. So if we look at last year's soybean data, full season was about 80 bushels across the board, and that's statewide. Double crop was about a little bit under 73. So about a 7 bushel difference there between full season and double crop. Double crops actually performed fairly well this last year, despite kind of the wet weather we had later in the season. But that's statewide, so we can split this into full season or double crop alone. So if we look just at full season across the maturity group spectrum, Group fours absolutely had an advantage there, a little over 83 bushel compared to Group fives, and then sixes and then sevens. There's a trend that Dr. Van has talked about, planting full season. And for us, full season is typically mid-May, mid to late May. We're obviously not planting into April in these situations because we don't have seed in time. But even in a mid-May planting scenario, we're seeing the same trend that Dr. Van sees, that Group 4 has an advantage yield-wise, followed by that Group 5, and then it kind of trends down from there. Now, this is statewide, so this is across the entire state. We can split that further out by regions and look how each region did independently across the maturity groups that we saw. So if we look at Piedmont, Tidewater, Coastal Plain absolutely had a higher yield this last year. I think a large part due to being able to handle the wetter stress that we saw later in the season. Piedmont MG4s were the better option there full season. It fell off fairly drastically once we got into those later maturities. That makes sense. You don't see a lot of later maturities in the Piedmont. Tidewater, same story. Group 4s, which are usually predominant in full season, out there did really, really well. And again, fell off as you went to Group 7s. The interesting part is the coastal plain. So you see that MG4s, MG5s are essentially the same. You have a little dip in MG6s, but MG7 and 8s are essentially the same. You really didn't have a drop off across maturity groups for full season soybeans this last year. I attribute a lot of that to the early season dry stress that we had and the impact that it had on those MG4s, but you still had excellent yields across the board there. So we really didn't see a drop off by maturity group in the coastal plain like we saw on the Piedmont and then the Tidewater. So that's full season. Double crop, we can do the exact same thing. If you look double crop, again, those later maturities tend to do a little bit better. There's not a huge difference there. You're talking 74 to 72 bushels, only a couple of bushels difference. Again, that's statewide, so we can drill it back down into the different regions. And overall, you kind of see a very similar pattern. Piedmont, really no difference across the board, maybe a little bit drop off in MG5s. Tidewater, you see again a good advantage of having them 4 or 5s in a double crop situation that drops off. Coastal Plain, 5s are your best option in that situation. But Coastal Plain, you can see you actually had a kind of worse yield this last year from all that weather stress that we had, those wetter soils, than we saw in the Piedmont and the Tidewater. But again, same with what Dr. Van has seen in the past. Not really an advantage of certain maturity group based off of double crop planting, right? So we're seeing kind of very even yields across the board there. Because we have this database now, I can look back at 7 years of worth of data. I can start identifying if there's trends associated with a maturity group by planting date, right? So we're looking at 7 years worth of maturity group. In blue bars is full season, and red bars is double crop planting. And then across the bottom, you see MG4, MG5, MG6, MG7. Obviously, there's an advantage there planting MG4s and MG5s full season compared to when you look at double crop. A little bit of an advantage of planting Group 6 and Group 7. It's over 7 years, but fairly even across the board otherwise. Now that's statewide, and we've seen that there's differences by region. So I can actually drill that down into a region over 7 years, and I can identify trends there. I know this graph is busy. I haven't figured out a better way of displaying this. But think of it in terms of this. The first 3 bars for each mature group you're seeing is full season. The next 3 bars that you're seeing is double crop. So blue, green, red, full season, purple, blue, orange, double crop. And Coastal Plain, Piedmont, Tidewater is the order of those bars. So Coastal Plain's that first bar, Piedmont's the second, Tidewater's the third. And you look and see if I'm in the Coastal Plain and I'm playing a Group 4, I'm having a better yield advantage there than necessarily Group 5, 6, or 7. I want to point out, however, the drop off is not very drastic. You go from a 77 bushel in Group 4s to about a 72 bushel yield average in Group 5s. That's only about a 5 bushel difference, right? Compare that to Tidewater. Tidewater is at 84 bushel for Group 4 and 75 bushel for Group 5. It's almost a 10 bushel, 9 bushel difference there. So you see a larger drop off in the Tidewater than you necessarily see in the Coastal Plain, which tells me that we can plan a Group 4, Group 5 full season and probably be about the same, maybe a couple bushels off for there. But you don't see that drop off as you go further into different maturity groups. I also want to point out what that looks like for double crop. Look at the Group 4 double crop yield for Coastal Plain over 7 years. This is 7 years worth of data, 2,000 data points, a little bit over that. You're talking 56 bushel to 58 bushel to 62 to 62. Obviously, there's an advantage in planting later maturity groups in the Coastal Plain that you don't necessarily see in the other regions. A lot of that's due to the stress that we see. Planting a Group 4 behind wheat into a dry soil that we typically have in Coastal Plain doesn't give it the advantage, can't get the vegetative growth on it to set pods. You don't see a yield advantage from that, whereas those determinants that you see in Group 7, Group 6, Group 7, and really later Group 5 help you overcome some of those stressors from planting into wheat stubble and those dry sandy soils. I'll have all this available so y'all don't have to take a snapshot of it, but I'll be sending this out along with the video for today's webinar, so you can kind of dig down into this a little bit more, kind of understand where your maturity group should be based off your regions. And again, this is just based off of OVT data for the last 7 years. Okay. The other thing I wanted to do, the question I had is, okay, we see an advantage there planting later in double crop. Do we see an advantage of indeterminate versus determinate? Now, I'm just focusing on Group 5s. The majority of Group 4s are indeterminate. The majority of Group 6 and 7s are determinate. I want to look at that divider there in Group 5s. Has there been a yield advantage to planting an indeterminate 5 versus a determinate 5? So you're talking about an early 5 on average, not all of them are indeterminate, to a late 5, which is predominantly determinate. And you can see that there is, again, a little bit confusing, but it's set up. The first 2 bars are full season. The second 2 bars in each grouping are double crop, statewide, and then the 3 regions behind it. The first bar is indeterminate, second bar is determinate for full season, and then you go determinate, indeterminate, determinate for double crop for the next 2 bars. And you can see in just about every situation across any different region, there's a slight yield advantage of planting those indeterminate 5s versus the determinate 5s. This is over 7 years. And I thought to myself, well, maybe I'm seeing a skew in the data. Maybe I have 1,000 data points for indeterminate and I only have like 200 for determinate. That's not the case. I almost have equal numbers of representation across both growth habits. So there's a slight advantage. Statewide, it's about a 3 bushel advantage in full season and about a 5 bushel advantage double crop. Coastal plain, about a 4 bushel advantage to a 2 bushel advantage. You don't really see a inverse there where the determinants actually have an advantage over determinants. Now, you did see that this year. Determinants actually did a little bit better than indeterminants in the coastal plain. But overall, 7 years, there is a slight advantage of playing that indeterminate 5 versus playing the determinate 5, regardless of the region that you're in. Okay. If y'all have questions as I'm going through this, is not just me lecturing. You can raise your hand. I've got chat up. I've got everything up. So just let me know if you have questions as we go through. So long story short, Group 4, Group 5 still have an advantage. For sure, Group 4 is planted full season. Once you get into a double crop situation, you really have a pick 'em. You can pick whatever maturity group you want. You can pick really kind of wherever you want to be in that spectrum, possibly with the exception of a Tidewater where you still have a little bit of advantage of Group 4, Group 5s because of the yield environments out there. But overall, double crop, you can pick just about any maturity group and you'd be okay. When we look at determinate versus indeterminate, I know more work will be done on this by Michaela, but for our data, just looking very generally, you see a little bit of a yield advantage playing an indeterminate 5 versus a determinate 5 across different regions for the last 7 years. Now we're talking about maturity groups, talking about traits, because I know that's the next question. Well, Ryan, do you see an advantage of trait? Now, this is just looking at 2024 data. I've not pulled this in for 7 years worth because it's obviously going to change over 7 years. When a trait first comes out, it's going to have a little bit of a yield disadvantage that it overcomes once genetics catch back up. So I'm just looking at this year. You really don't see a difference in trait yield. If you look at extend flex, where a lot of our entries were this last year, 77 to 79. When you look at enlist SDS, 75 to 78, we're in the same range for both of those yields. We're within noise. I mean, there's not a definitely advantage. You're going to say, well, Ryan, conventional SDS is 85 bushel. And I want to point out the fact there's only 10 data points for that trait. So that's kind of a skew in how that data looks. But if you drew a line to this, everything that we're looking at between enlist and extend flex, all about the same. The only thing I would maybe point out is Roundup Ready, just the generic trait Roundup Ready is starting to fall off just a little bit. But again, there's not enough looks there. You're talking 59 versus 600. It's just not, it's a tenth of the number of entries or data points that we had for Extend Flex. But if you're a grower making a choice based off a trait, obviously there's other considerations going into that. But if you're making it genetically, you really have no advantage of one trait over another. I think the genetics that you're choosing are more important at this point than the trait that you're actually using, depending on what your management style is in that situation. But you can pick an enlist, you can pick an extend flex, you can pick a conventional. Obviously, you're going to lose a little bit of yield potential there, but not as much as you would think. But overall, you have a lot of good options there. So with all that being said, I do want to point out kind of what our variety selection model has been. This is something I came up with when I first started back in 2016, with something that we continue to press. We want to start with 3 and 2 year data. And we put the most of our acreage in those selections because it's our best predictor of how those varieties can perform in those environments. And we'll look at that when we're going through the actual selection in the tool. We can't stop there because turnover in any crop is fairly high. In soybeans, particularly Group 4s, it's warp speed. So you have to be in a situation as a grower that you're ready to look at a newer variety on a limited basis. I don't want to plant this on more than a field or two. You want to look at those newer varieties on a limited basis so that you're ready to swap those into your major production if and when those old and steady standards are gone. You don't want to come into a selection situation ready to plant the old and steady that you've always planted and being told that it's no longer available, and now you've got to scramble and find something new. You want to be prepared. You want to have done your homework ahead of time and have those newer ones ready to roll into a larger percentage of your acreage. In general, I don't want to plant any selections on more than a third of my acreage, but the vast majority of those acres needs to be in that 3 and 2 year data selection. And then a field or two here comes in your single year statewide that you pick out, but you support that single year statewide selection based off of the location data from the OVT, based off of agent data that you have in your local area, based off of agent strip trial data, based off of industry experience, or you got a neighbor that grew that hybrid or that variety that last year. You want to support that single year data as much as possible with other sources of data, because the more data you have, the better you're going to feel about how that variety is going to perform in your environment. And then I want to touch real quickly on percent trial mean, because I'm going to be focused on percent trial mean when I start talking about the data. Why am I using percent trial mean? It's because I'm trying to standardize how we're looking at variety performance across different regions and across different time points. Okay. I just showed you where Coastal Plain did a lot better yield-wise this last year for full season soybeans. If you're a grower making a selection in the Piedmont for full season soybeans on raw yield, that's going to get skewed towards Coastal Plain selections. Does that make sense? Because that's a higher number. It's going to go towards a higher number. Same thing for years. 1 year is not the same as yield level as the next year. So if I have a yield level of 100 bushel last year and it's only 70 this year, all my selections are going to get skewed towards the environment of whatever that last year was, the higher number. So we want to standardize this by looking at them in terms of how they perform against everything else in their tests. All right. So for example, I have here, like if I'm looking at a group 5 variety and the average yield of all the group 5s this last year was 100 bushel. And the variety I'm looking at is variety A, and it came in 110 bushel. That's plus 10% of the trial mean. Does that make sense? If the other variety I'm looking at came in at 90 bushel, it's minus negative 10% of the trial mean. And for me, I'm looking at anything 3% or higher. You can choose whatever number you want to. I choose 3 because that's just above the noise level of it not being significantly different from everything else in the test. I want to look at anything that's separating from that average and it's separating significantly from that average, so I feel like it's a good performer for my environment. So that's why I'm targeting 3% or higher. But this is why we're looking at percent trial mean, because we're wanting to standardize all those looks across the different regions, different environments, and across the years that we're testing them in. Anybody have any questions on kind of the background of the data from this last year? Okay. Now I'm gonna move on to doing some variety selections. I can't show you everything. We can't go through everything, single maturity group, every single region, because we will be here. And I know folks are getting on to the agronomic program team meeting here at 10 o'clock. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on where the maturity groups were telling me to go. So I'm going to do that to start with. I'm going to look at group 4, group 5 full season across the different regions. I'm going to look at all maturity groups, okay, for double crop across all the different regions. And we'll do that for multi-year. We'll do that for single year. So that'll be my first set. If we have enough time when those are done, anybody on the call that wants to look at a specific maturity group, trait, any kind of combination like that, raise your hand, type in chat what you want to see, and we can do those fairly quickly. So we're in the tool right now. I think it's showing up. Yep. So we're going to go to soybeans, OVT data, and we'll have data from this last year. Let me get rid of all this mess. I always do custom. You can choose whatever maturity group you want if you're focused on a specific one, but because we're looking at multiples, I'm going to do custom. I don't know why this is not going away. Thank you. When I do custom, I'm using, again, percent of trial mean. We talked about why. I'm gonna go ahead and load all that data in, and then I'm gonna filter it to what I'm curious about or what I'm wanting to look at. So in this case, I'm gonna filter it to a planting timing of full season, and I'm gonna filter it to a maturity group of 4 or 5. Contains 4 or 5. And that'll give me all the data that I want to see. I'm gonna pull this out. All right. Again, you scroll over. I'm focusing on multiple year data to start with. So I want anything in here that doesn't have, I want anything that just has a Y2 or Y3. You can obviously do this manually. I like to filter it out. So you can add another filter to here and just tell it that you want number of trial years, which is right there, greater than 1. And that'll filter out all of your Y1s. And then we get rid of that again. All right, so now I should just have multiple year data. When I look at multiple year data within this tool, I'm just focused on this 22 to 24 average area, because I can look at regions. I have enough data. I can look at how it performed in a region. I don't have to look statewide necessarily. So if we start with Tidewater, for instance, and I'm going to click on Tidewater twice, it's going to be high to low for Tidewater. You see that I've got a Dynagrow and AGS. This is actually believe it or not, this is conventional. I got Dynagrow and AGS conventional, progeny, an NK, a progeny. This is a Stein. another Dynagrow, and a couple of other another AGS conventional, and this is an Asgrow. So I do 3% or higher. So really this high soy line is probably not my floor, but it's where I'd stop and I'd choose anything that's above this. So this would be my Tidewater multiple year selection. I can compare those. Now I can get all the information here now based off of how they performed. If they'll do, I gotta do the thing. Sorry. 1 second. Take you out. There we go. So now I'll get all of the information for each one of those varieties and how they performed. I'm going to go ahead and link that in the chat so that y'all can, if you decide you want to look at this is Tidewater full season MG4 5. From here, you can pull this complete table out by hitting export. You can take that to your retailer, your seed dealer, and tell them that these are the varieties you're interested in. But you got a lot of different companies here that you're looking at, from Growmark to USG to Asgrow to Harvey's, Stein. Like there's a lot of different options there, a lot of different trait options there. Enlist, Extend Flex, conventional. I will mention these two conventionals. It's 4921, and I think it's 54. I can't remember the number. Yeah, 5422. These have actually been very high performing conventionals across environments for the last couple of years. If I'm a grower looking at trying a conventional, I would start with these two first and then work your way into the NC Dumfies. Dumphy will be a little bit later. Obviously, you got a 5.4 here in this 5422, and then you've got I think it's a 4.8, 4.9, and that's 4921. But they've been very high performing conventionals along with NC Dumfries. So those would be some good conventional options if you want to shoot your growers that way. But a lot of different options across the board for different companies in that situation.
Hey,
that's
Ryan,
yes, sir.
When you get to that point, or maybe before you get to that point, if you're looking for a particular technology, say if you wanted to look at only Enlist varieties, I reckon how would you go back in there and update it?
So if you'll notice, I keep clicking the setup. Whenever you click the setup, it takes your filter options. It doesn't take them off, but it removes this little window here so you got more window space. So anytime you want to pull them back, you just click setup again. I'd go back to filters, and you can actually add another option that's just trait. I forget what we call it in here. I want to say it's trait, but I might be trait package. Yep. So if you look at trait package, you can tell it that I just want enlist STS. And then you can filter from there, and it just pulls everything out that's not enlist STS in that situation. So those would be your options. Any other questions? I'm going to refilter back to the original. And then I'm going to take you off so I have more screen space. So that was Tidewater. Look at Coastal Plain. I think you're going to see some very similars. You're going to say, Ryan, you did group 4, group 5. You're right. We have some group 3s in here. We treat them in the group 4 test because we don't have enough group 3s to do a group 3 test. It's actually part of what we call a group 4 early test. So it's grouped with the group 4s. But you see a 3.9, you see a 5.4 USG, you see a 4.9 Dynagrow, another Asgrow 4.9 NK. This AK line, these Dynagrow, Asgrow lines, this Dynagrow line, those have been fairly high performers, particularly in the coastal plain environment. A lot of good options here. Again, across a large swath of traits. I'll go ahead and pull this compare out and put it in chat so you have access to that. But again, this is where I would start. 4.5, full season, multiple year data. This is where I would start. Okay. Again, all the information is here. We do have some disease ratings that we pull in. And then a lot of the different, I know a lot of growers are starting to ask how the OVT is, the management styles of the OVT. Some of that data is in here. So if population's in here, row spacing's in here. I don't have herbicides in here. We do have it in the wheat tool, but some of the management data is also in here. It's also online on the OVT website if you want to look there. So that's coastal plain multi-year, and then we can look at Piedmont the same way. I'm gonna take these off. You're gonna see some of the same varieties showing up. There will be some differences based off the environment. You're seeing that you actually have a lot of different options here. This Asgrow came in the top. Again, the NK lines there, the two USGs, Dynagro, Don Mario, and Progeny. And again, there's that AGS conventional, that 4921. So I'll go ahead and pull these in for multi-year so that y'all have access to that. Any questions on that so far? Okay. What I like to do, I mean, yes, I'm sorting by Piedmont, I'm sorting by coastal plain. I want to kind of showcase one thing here. So here's statewide, right? So these should be like the cream of the crop because they perform across all the different environments. And for the most part, they are. You have a lot of strong varieties here. I'll point out one thing here. This USG variety, which is a very good variety, 7543. It performs really well statewide, really well in the Piedmont, really well in the coastal plain. Where it doesn't perform as well is in the Tidewater. See, that's negative 2.3% trial mean, right? Those are the differences that we're trying to pull out here. We're trying to pull these differences out. Like, look down here. This Asgrow 39XF3 over, I don't know how Y1 got in there, over 1 year was at the top of the coastal plain, right? But it's near the bottom, or actually close to average, not near the bottom. It's close to average overall for all the different varieties. So these are the differences that you're wanting to pull out. You know, here's a USG line, did really well in the Piedmont, pretty well in the coastal plain, not as well in the Tidewater. And there's some reverses of this as you go further down. You know, you're wanting to pull out these differences here so you can find those that are well suited for your environment there. So that's multiple year. I can go back and look at single year data because we want to look at single year to make sure that we're not missing any newer varieties. I took this filter off, so we got everything coming back in. The difference I'm going to have here compared to what I was looking at full season is I'm not looking at this. I'm looking at 2024 averages. I'm just looking at this past year's data, and I'm just looking at statewide. All I'm doing here is looking across statewide all the way down, and then I'm looking across. Okay, it did really well. This project did really well last year. Statewide, did it do well across environments? It did. Did this Dynagro line did the exact same thing? It did. And these are all Y1s. I think the first 2-year data we get to is this Dynagro line down here, this 49XF43. These top 5 are all 1-year data. That shows you how much turnover we're having in this group 4 test. So I would start here and work your way down and say, okay, well, here's 5 right here that I could start with. They did fairly well across the board. You could argue that this high soy was closer to average than some of these others. Same for this Dynagro and the Tidewater, but overall, a lot of good options here. Now, you can sort this by coastal plain. If you're in the coastal plain environment, say, okay, well, still, I want to look at, you know, you already pulled this this AGS line out because of the 3-year data, but here's a Y1 Stein, this 47 EEO2. Really, really well in the coastal plain. Actually did pretty well statewide. This is probably one that I would look at for coastal plain environments, but I'm using this statewide data as my primary decider and then making sure that it makes sense for the environment I'm in. So you could sort coastal plain and just look at statewide if you wanted to do it in reverse. You know, here's one. This is an AGS. You won't be able to get that one because it's still an experimental. Here's the USG 7485 ETS. Did really well coastal plain, really well Piedmont. Overall, pretty well statewide. I mean, it's a little bit below my floor, but your floor could be different for Tidewater. So those would be where I would start based off the different regions if I'm looking at single year data. That makes sense? Any questions on that? I can do polls here if you want me to, but up to y'all. Okay. If not, I'm going to go to double crop. So we can do double crop multiple year real quick. We'll emphasize single year on double crop as well. But I really want to get to a point where y'all have any questions that we can answer them. So I'll go back to double crop. We're going to add in all the maturity groups here. We'll filter it back. So this will be essentially everything minus the group 3 and double crop. Take you off. We'll do the same way, Tidewater first. So there's actually a 6.8 that showed up fairly well, and that's 1 year. Let me get out 1 year. I wanted to go get multiple years. Two, one, filter. Okay. I'll take you back off, and then I'm looking here. Tidewater, this is multiple years, so I should have, yep. So Asgrow all the way down, there's a bunch of options here. Integra, all the way down to Integra did really well. Coast or Tidewater over essentially 2 years. We have a couple of 3-year data points in there, but a lot of these, particularly group fours, don't last in the test for more than a couple of years. So this is Tidewater. That. Then we go back and look at Coastal Plain the same way. You're going to have a ton of options here. Now, it's because we're looking at multiple maturity groups. Obviously, if you have a grower that's focused on group fours, you're going to filter this down to group four. Same if they have 5, 6, 7, or they have a set of maturity groups they're interested in. The only reason I'm representing all of the maturity groups here is because our data says that there's really not a huge difference in maturity group once you get into a double crop situation. My floor is 3, so I'm coming all the way down to this Integra line, and then you've got some progenies. This is a Seedway line, Integra and K. Again, a lot of good options. There's that conventional again from AGS. Revere's in there. So 24 across multiple maturity groups. I'll look at that again. And we'll do the same thing for Tidewater. Okay, sorry. I do want to point out, while you're going through these, if you're like, well, Ryan, you know this is Integra, but I don't know that XF7223 is Integra. One thing you can do is click this little book right next to it. It'll take you to the information specific for that variety. And it'll tell you, okay, this is what the company is, where it was tested, where it says Auburn in here, and I'll get to that in a minute, but where we're linked to. And then it has just the data for that variety if you're just interested in that one variety in that look, in that view. But if you have questions on what a variety is based off the nomenclature here, you can just click on that little book and it'll tell you. A lot more options in the Piedmont, which makes sense given the maturity group spread that we have. Again, all the way down the Seedway line and then up. I think we'll have probably a little over 25. When I'm making a selection for a grower, I'm focused more on the 8 to 10. Once you get above 10, it tends to kind of be a lot. So I would probably not give them a full list of all the maturity groups for double crop. I'd probably go in and say, okay, we know any maturity group would work. Is there a certain maturity group based off your management style that you're focused on that we could focus down for you and get you a smaller subset of options based off of OVT data to try? This is Piedmont. All MGs. Since we've already brought it up, and I'll go back to it here, we are able to access other states' data now. Right now, we're linked up to Clemson, we're linked up to Auburn, and for soybeans, we're linked up to Virginia. I don't know the Virginia part's in just yet. The way you can get to that data, if you're interested in it, if you go to this trial blocks option, you'll see it's shared trial groups here. And you do that click down, and you can see we can select Auburn or Clemson if we want to look at their soybean data at the exact same time. For me, I think this is most important for those growers, for sure, Clemson. If you're on that border of South Carolina, you get some more options, some more views. I don't know what the soil types are here. I think predominantly sandy soils, particularly in the PD. We'll see what they actually have in here. I'll probably have to take my filters off because they're going to be filtered differently. Yep, I am. No way. There we go. So this is going to be everything because I don't know how they have their data filtered in here, but I was not even showing because I did not enable it. There we go. And I don't know that they have 2024 data loaded. I'm gonna have to do this for 2023. We'll look and see. No, they don't. So this is where their data would go if it was loaded. Their 2024 data is not loaded yet. I think I remember that. But you would see it in 2023. I bring this up for 2 points. One, we have access to other OVT data. If we want to look at more environments, we can. And that gives us more selection power for making the selections based off the environment we're doing. Okay. The second one, and I think this is more important, more relevant to the group, is this is how I would like to start displaying county agent data. I would like to start moving county agent data into this view so that a grower can go to a trial block and say, okay, I want all the OVT data, but I also want this county, this county, this county's data, right? So that they have the option of selecting the county data they can filter on, they can look at the exact same views that they're looking at OVT data on, and that centralizes all that data into one place. I'm getting ready to send an email out about this. We're going to start with corn. So agent corn data, I'm going to start migrating into this tool, starting with last year's data and then moving forward with this year's data. I want to start with corn because it's fairly concise, it's fairly easy, and I can have a conversation with the developer about how I want it viewed in here. If that goes successfully, then I'm going to move on to having soybeans included in here as well. Because I think there's a lot of benefit to having that data across not just OVT, but all the different county testing that's going on all in one place. And that way a grower, if they're interested, or even agents, if they're interested, want to go in here, they can make selections based off of not only OVT data, but how it performed in their county tests or vice versa. So that's why I'm displaying this here, is because I want to actually move this. Yes, we're connected to other OVT programs, and I think that's important, particularly on those areas where we're bordering those states, or if we're able to identify those environments and how they work for us. But I think the more important point here is that we can potentially move agent data into the same kind of view, and then we're able to make selections and filter based off that data as well. Anybody have any questions? I'm going to get the Clemson data off for now. And we'll do a real quick 1 year on all maturity groups. I'm going to take Clemson off. And again, if you ever want to, it's under select third-party data and then select trial groups, and that's where you tell it. And then you got to come down here and actually tell it that you want to look at that data at the same time. All right, we'll do planting timing, double crop. And we'll do maturity group, all of them. So now we're just looking at 1 year data. Again, I'm only looking at last year's test results here because I'm looking at just a single year data. And I'm keeping in mind whether there's Y1s, Y3s here like this. Again, this AGS line is showing up. But again, just like we saw with full season, you've got 5, actually 6 here that are brand new. Now, all of these are group 4s, 4.9, 4.9, 4.8. That's not true. There's a 6.8 in here, a 4.8 and a 4.9. So all of these, except for one, are group 4s. That tells you the power of having a group 4 and double crop overall this last year. But you can start looking at, I want to point this out for Norman, you and Dylan. Like if you're looking at Coastal Plain, yes, this Dynagrow line did really, really well. It's a 1 year data, so keep that in mind. Did really well statewide, did well in Piedmont, did well in Tidewater. It's not that it did poorly in the Coastal Plain, but it's closer to average in the Coastal Plain, right? This probably wouldn't be one that I would emphasize over maybe these 4 that are above it, where they're all greater than 10% of trial mean in the Coastal Plain. Does that make sense? So that's kind of what I want y'all to do when looking at single year data. When looking at multiple year data, you can look at the region all by itself and decide from there. When you're looking at single year data, I want you thinking about, yes, it did well statewide. Did it do as well in my region that I'm looking at? Because this is going to be predominantly sandy soils in the Coastal Plain, predominantly silt loam organic soils in the Tidewater, and predominantly clay soils in the Piedmont. Obviously, there's differences. There's sand in all 3. But predominantly, that's what we're testing on. How did it perform, not only in that soil type, but in that environment for that single year? Because you're wanting these varieties to prove it. These have to prove it to the grower that they're going to work before they go into a larger percentage of their acreage. And that's really kind of why I trend to a lower number of selections. Like if I'm looking at selections here, my top 6 here are all Y1s. I think there's another, this Revere one is brand new. You skip those Asgrow, and then you got 2 more new ones here, this NK and this High Soy. I would probably stop there. I don't know that I'd go all the way down to 3% unless I found specific varieties that did, that's a Y3, so we've had it before. Looking for a good coastal plain one. That's a Y3. Here's a Y1. So it's NK47, 8.5%. It's Y1, brand new. 11.2% the coastal plain. I would look at this as an option over, this high soy line that's only 1.8% in the coastal plain. So that's kind of how I approach it when I'm looking at single year data. I want these varieties to prove it to me because this is just 1 year data. So it might change based off of the weather pattern for the next year. It may change based off of any number of different factors. Until we get to a 2-year or 3-year situation, we don't feel quite as comfortable how they're going to fit in these environments, but we do get indicators of where they're going to fit. Not Troy. Actually, Troy, for you, this Dynagrow line might be actually a good option. Really good statewide, top of the Piedmont test from last year, right? You may want to look at this where Norman and Dylan may not want to look at it for their areas. Although Dylan, I know you got some clay soil types up in your area too. Does that make sense? How I would approach the single year doe? That's all I've got on my side as far as looking at specific filters or searches. Does anybody on the call want to look at a specific filter or a look?
Hey, Ryan, I would be interested in maybe just walking through selecting for root knot nematode resistance.
Okay, so that's a good question, Norman. I will say we do have root knot resistance ratings in here. They're not based off of our data, they're based off of company data because I want to give the growers a starting point. The majority of those are based off of incognita. So potentially not the species that we're looking at here. So I would use whatever ratings are in here with the biggest grain of salt that you've got available to you, because while they'll work against incognita in particular, we may have a different species they may not work against. It's just for me, it's more of this might work in a root knot environment, not that this will work in a root knot environment. Does that make sense? So the way you look at that,
I agree, but that's like you said, that's the only information we got. So
right. So and that we got to have a starting point. I'm talking to Adrian about specifically guava root knot resistance ratings, but I think I want to see what our options are for doing other nematode ratings because they're just not well fleshed out across the industry. Some groups have better ways of getting that data than others. So you can filter this data by root knot nematode. You can ask it for, I would take R with a very heavy grain of salt. You can ask it for R, MR, and you can filter that, and that will give you, see it found nothing. Should give you everything, but there apparently, I don't know why it's not. I know there's lines in here. Let me go back, unfilter this. Should give you, let's just pick some random ones here and pull them in. Compare. Right, so here we go. So there's this Integra axis. This axis line says it's MR for root knot. I definitely wouldn't plant this Revere line in a root knot situation because if they're calling it S, then we know it's sensitive to root knot. I would try this MR line where it's a blank. Either I didn't have data to access, which is the majority of them, or the data was so inconclusive that I didn't want to put any kind of rating in there. I was very conservative when it came to pulling these ratings in. So like this progeny line, this Revere line, I probably wouldn't plant in root knot situations. I would try maybe this axis line if it's a heavy root knot situation, along with maybe this seedway line. So that's the way I would approach it. These resistance ratings are in here. You can filter for them. You can search for them. When you pull down the variety list from what you're looking at, they come through in this view. So there's multiple ways of getting to them, but you need to take them with a very big grain of salt. Rs and MRs are probably going to be a better option for root knot, but they are not a guarantee they're going to be resistant to whatever root knot species we have out there. Does that make sense? I'd say the same for soybean cyst nematode. You know, I have MR3, MR14. These are races of soybean cyst nematode that are just standard across the nation. We really don't have, if we think about the races that we have in North Carolina for cyst, we don't really have good resistance in our profile to soybean cyst nematode. In our varieties that are available to us. There's not a lot, if any, alt cysts I'm aware of at least, that are in our test for the last couple of years. Unfortunately, that's just kind of standard, and that's kind of what I want to talk to Adrian about, if there's options to do some nematode ratings on our side, so that we can get more specific ratings to our races. I will say we do have other disease ratings in here. I pulled in frog eye where I can. I do feel pretty good about these frog eye resistances, because that's a standard way of testing against frog eye. We may have slightly different species, but I feel fairly good about that. We don't have a ton of stem canker out here. We don't have a ton of southern death out here. So it's really going to be frog eye. Phytophthora is the same way. These are all field tolerance ratings. I did not pull genetic ratings in here. I just pulled in field tolerance ratings because for me, that's a better indicator as how it's going to perform actually out in the field. So for y'all out in the field there, frog eye is going to be your primary there outside of the nematodes, and then maybe Phytophthora where you've got some lower lying wetter soils. We don't have a ton of other disease ratings in here, and that's unfortunate. I wish we had a lot more to flesh this out. I am happy that we're pulling in metribuzin sensitivity where it exists, because some companies, not all, are doing metribuzin testing. We are pulling in chloride sensitivity where it exists, excluder, includer for those that are on the coast or looking at salt tolerance situations. And we're absolutely pulling in indeterminacy for growth habit, because I know that's going to be something we're focused on moving forward. So there's a lot more data in here than just yield performance data. There's a lot of characteristics data in here that we tried to pull in where it makes sense, but being very conservative about how we report that information. Any other questions? Anybody else want to look at a specific thing? Troy?
One of the things we run into this year is this Asgrow, the AG57XF1.
Mhm.
It is a indeterminate that does very well on what was considered, marginal land. Some of this soil that's poorly drained, soil types that we've seen it do well in is like Kirksky, some of this yellow gray stuff. Very sticky clay. But this past year we saw, people saw that and how it really performed well. And then but when they turned around and put that on some of what would be considered your better land, some of these, soils that typically make 200 bushel corn, some of these, the red, like some of the, Herndon, those type soils like that, it didn't do as well. Is there a way to put that into the filter system?
Not really. So here's the way I approach looking at yield level. If you think broadly, and this is a very generic version on my side, anything in the tidewater is typically going to be a high yielding situation, right? You're talking about high organic soils, silt loam soils are going to hold nutrients. So I look at, if I'm thinking about high, medium, low, I think about tidewater probably being my highest yielding region. Piedmont, Coastal Plain, you're trading off. I know Coastal Plain won this last year, but Piedmont and Coastal Plain, you're typically trading off if you're medium or low. It makes sense to me based off of what I'm seeing here. So I just pulled in the information for that specific variety, and that's what you're looking at here. I'm just looking at percent trial mean. Obviously, we just had that test in 2023, so it's 1 year data. Take that with a grain of salt. You're right at average in Piedmont, so it's telling me that we may not have got it on those same kind of soils that you're talking about. Did really well Coastal Plain, 7.7%, but look at Tidewater. It's just above average. So if it's going to perform in higher yielding environments, I expect that Tidewater number to be really, really high. Does that make sense? If it's going to handle stress environments, I expect it to be high either in Coastal Plain or in Piedmont. This tells me that maybe it had some issues on the clay soils that we put it on, but when you put it on stressier sandy soils in the Coastal Plain, it did really, really well.
Well, looks wise, looks are deceiving when it looks a lot of times, especially with soybeans. But people would say, "What variety is that?" And you tell them, and next thing you know, they'd bought a bunch of it, and planted it.
Right.
Because it does look it's kind of looking at wheat compared to triticale on some of this tough soil. It just has that showy appearance.
Yep. No, it's Asco lines in general have a very nice appearance. I think we had 48XFO or 1 as a border a couple of years ago. And the growers were like, what is that variety? That looks really, really nice. And they look nice. They yield really, really well. Um, Unfortunately, I don't have a high yield, low yield filter in this. Maybe that's something that we get to eventually, but that's how I approach it. I look at Tidewater results in general, how it performed out there and how it performed in some of these stressor environments in the coastal plain. If this number is only 2.5%, again, this is 1 year data, so big grain of salt. If this number is not closer to 9, 10%, it's probably not going to work in a high yield environment. If this number is, if this number is higher, it's probably going to work in a more stressed environment, right? It's going to be, I hate this term, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's going to be a workhorse versus a racehorse. It's going to be something that does fairly well regardless of stress, but if you put it in something where it can just go out and out yield, it doesn't quite get there. And you can see the yield numbers. Look at the yield numbers. They're very close together between these two environments when typically this number is at least 5 bushels higher than what we're seeing on average. So that's how I approach it. And I know that's a gross generalization, but if I'm looking high yield versus low yield, how does it perform in the Tidewater versus how does it perform in the coastal plain? With Piedmont in there as kind of an option. And that's kind of how I determine how that works. And that makes sense. Based off of what you just described to me, this number makes absolutely complete sense. Any other questions?
Hey Ryan, how about for foliar diseases? Do y'all use fungicides on an as needed basis, or I might have missed that earlier?
No. So the typical OVT, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning, the typical OVT program is planted on 15-inch row spacings in between either 145 or 190,000 population. We use a Roundup herbicide program for our Roundup tolerant varieties, a conventional herbicide program for our conventionals. Only insecticide goes out once we hit threshold for either worms or stink bugs or any other pests that we have out there. We do not apply fungicide at any location because we tried it last year, but we're going to try to flush that out this year. Leanne is going around to these different locations to do disease ratings so that we can start putting our own ratings into that tool versus having to pull in ratings from externally. So my goal there is to start getting ratings. And in general, we don't see enough of a disease pressure that we're really losing a large amount of yield, if that makes sense. It's not a situation like in wheat where if we hit leaf rust, we're dropping yield by 40 bushel. But there's enough of a disease pressure out there that we can get some good ratings and then provide that back to growers is the hope. But that's the typical.
I was
Go
going
ahead.
to ask, I heard a grower say the other day, made the comment that a salesman had told him that saw frog eye more in as-grow varieties versus others. Have you seen anything that verifies that?
Not specifically because I just haven't walked it enough to do ratings. I have noticed variety to variety at a couple of locations, not last year, but the year before. But I didn't like hone in on specific companies, if that makes sense. Asgrow, from what I remember years ago when I was at Syngenta, has good resistance to frog eye and has poor resistance to frog eye, but that's the same across just about every company that's providing those genetics. So. Any other questions? All right. I'll make I'll make my slide deck available to everybody. When I send out this recording, I'll make available on YouTube in case you want to go back to look at specific things. But if you have any questions, if you have growers that are interested in specific data, holler at me. I'm happy to help Timmy B make some tables for his group. If you hit some snags with the tool, let me know. I'm happy to help kind of overcome them. So thank you for your time, and hope you all have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Thanks.